finally, let's move on to talk about the surprise resignation of Jacinda Ardern. Seems to come out of nowhere for a lot of people. Tom, you've been thinking about Saint Jacinda.
I haven't stopped for many, no. But the response I found was really, really quite striking. So again, as you say, it was a surprise to many people, and how across the kind of international media set, there was all of this fawning. So a lot of people saying this is almost a unique kind of final act in politics, going on her own terms, so on and so forth, blithely ignoring the fact that the reason she is stepping down is because they've got an election in October and the polls don't look very good.
Yeah. That
whilst Jacinda Mania has endured amongst global media elites, it hasn't amongst the New Zealand people. So it seems quite like, a politician beating a hasty retreat because they don't think they're going to be re-elected is not a unique story. But because of the fact that she said, I'm not stepping down because I don't think I win, they just believe that and repeat it. It has been a reminder of just that remarkable status that Ardern has managed to maintain as a kind of figurehead of a kind of new, empathetic, kindly politics, or just as a kind of quite thin representation of like all that is good and holy, but maybe when you press people, they don't really understand. I think what's quite interesting is that it seems to be the kind of triumph of just kind of substance, of superficialities over substance when it comes to politics. Because if you actually talk about Ardern's record, it's quite restrictive on immigration. Incidentally, there was a scandal last year, I think, about a autistic 12-year-old not being able to come to the country because she would be too much of a drain on the health service. If people in the UK pursued those policies, they'd be all fascist and all the rest of it. So there's a kind of, they prefer her as a kind of symbol rather than what it is that she actually did in office. And I think that was a kind of interesting thing, because there's a lot of chatter about how, the problem these days is that there's too many idiots out there who get won over by celebrity and kind of, the glitz and glamour and so on. And yet even our kind of media elites seem, with figures like Ardern, to be as likely to just swoon over someone who says all the right things and strikes the right kind of image as far as they're concerned.
Look, I mean, there's probably two things Ardern is best known for. One is her sort of response, her empathetic response to the Christchurch massacre. But the other is, of course, the pandemic. And depending on how you view the pandemic, she's either a hero or a villain. So I think, many in our liberal set will see her as kind and empathetic for having obscenely harsh restrictions. Whereas, what would you say about that?
Well, I think she became a figurehead for the more totalitarian instincts across the globe during the COVID pandemic. And I think she became a useful figurehead for that particular response. And I think in response to Christchurch, it's worth remembering, yes, her response was in some senses humane, but she also passed very significant gun controls immediately after, and a lot of New Zealanders didn't like that. So I think that the primary message, as Tom has hinted at, is that this was a very mixed legacy, one which is on the international level, a figurehead, someone who did all the right things in front of the camera, holding up the "They Are Us" sign in the media aftermath of Christchurch as part of her press conference. But in terms of substance, the commentary this today has talked about a significant housing crisis in New Zealand that her government failed to deal with. She took quite conservative steps in respect to public spending. So there is this very interesting disparity between her international renown and her domestic fortunes.
Tom, on the COVID front, she's part of a kind of, I think of Jacinda and I think of Trudeau almost in the same breath. This kind of restrictive, authoritarian in practice, but liberal in appearance, if that makes sense.
No, completely. And it's interesting because as you were saying, like, you kind of have these sort of two sides of the coin, which you have the kind of fluffy image that people have of her. And then you also have what it is that she actually represented, which, as you say, on a domestic scale is a bit of a mixed bag. But when it comes to these kind of forms of liberal authoritarianism, she is a really key figurehead of that. It's kind of kindly authoritarianism, the kind of it's good for you really type of authoritarianism, which during COVID was incredibly extreme. Obviously, the zero COVID policy, the upshot of that was New Zealanders many of them out of the country, not being able to return home even to attend to dying relatives. When the policy effectively fell apart because of the new and transmissible variants, you then had a kind of rush to vaccinate people. This is often a story with zero COVID countries. They've never got enough people vaccinated. It was kind of false sense of security, I guess. And as a consequence of that, you end up with policies ushering in a kind of two-tier society, heavy restrictions for the unvaccinated. That kind of famous empathy and compassion was very much lacking in those situations. And then also even kind of putting the kind of COVID issue to one side, she also became a kind of very vocal spokesperson for another kind of front in this, and in many respects the most chilling front in this new kindly authoritarianism, of which Justin Trudeau, even a Joe Biden, is also a kind of figurehead of, which is on the level of freedom of speech. She gave that startling speech to the UN, back in September, where she was talking about misinformation and disinformation as the new weapons of war, and the way in which the international community, i.e. international leaders, needed to confront this, particularly in relation to things like climate change denialism, as she would call it. All but saying we basically need to usher in a kind of regime of censorship, almost on a kind of global level. Stopping short of that, of course, it's not really within her gift to usher in anything like that. But how that is, by the standards of anyone who calls themselves liberal, which is kind of the flock to which she sort of belongs internationally speaking, should raise hackles, and yet it's seen as entirely sensible and necessary. So on the one hand, she's a kind of insubstantial figure, a kind of screen onto which people around the world in the kind of metropolitan elites projected their kind of post-Trump, post-Brexit frustrations. Just kind of, she just became a kind of a figure in that, a kind of insubstantial figure in that sense. But in terms of what she did stand for, however you want to call it, it was this new kindly authoritarianism, which is basically taken over the entire Western world in one way, shape or form. So it's no surprise that people are kind of mourning her loss. But at the same time, that whole very grim liberalism, paternalism, acceptable authoritarianism, what you ever want to call it, it's not walking out with her, as it were.